afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for being here today. You probably know, some of you know, some of you don't. My name is Balaji, and I'm a colleague of Bidisha here at IIIT, and I'd like to share with you some ideas about smart cities and equity. Just a couple of things that I'd like to start off by saying. Your questions at any point, feel free to stop me, and I'll be happy to clarifications. But I'd also like to start off with asking a question. Why do you think we should be talking about smart cities, or what is it that you understand by that? There's nothing further to add. Let's just move on. I mean, one of the critical reasons why we're talking about, smart cities, we should be talking about cities in general, is the fact that we are becoming an increasingly urban planet. And if you look at the numbers, say by 2030, and I stop at 2030 because projections for 2050, the numbers are only bigger, but then in the long run we are dead, as John Maynard Keynes said. So we'll stop at 2030, which also is a nice sort of end point because it terminates with the sustainability goals. So if you look at 2030, India is likely to be about 40% urban, and the world at large about 60%, right? And if you actually look at numbers from the World Urbanization Project, etc., from where these numbers are taken, India will be more than 50% urban by the middle of this century, and we will be 2/3 urban, at a planetary scale. Right? So we're talking about large numbers, and we see this shift to an increasingly urban planet, notwithstanding, right, strong intellectual and ideological pushbacks that we've had in recent centuries, not least from people like Mahatma Gandhi, who said India lives in its villages, right? You had people, American thinkers like Thoreau, who wrote Walden Pond, who praised the virtues of living in nature. But all that seems to fall on deaf ears, for better or worse. We, as a race, are becoming increasingly urban, even in this country, right? And among the reasons for that is the fact that cities are increasingly sort of major contributors to our economic well-being, right? They contribute significant share of national income because a lot of the activities that are productive, when I say productive, this is not to pass judgment on one form of economic activity or another, right? But measures of productivity, right, in terms of output per hour or whatever indicator you might use, clearly point to the fact that most of those activities are urban in nature. And therefore, cities are also providing significant amounts of employment. The other reason, of course, is that there have been other changes that have been taking place. We can expect to see more of that. We are faced with current crises like climate change, which are making agriculture a lot less predictable, right? We're seeing war in many parts of the world. Just think of what's going on in a place like the Middle East, right? So there is a lot of movement of people that is unsettling them, okay? And where do many of them go? It is to the cities. So there's a good reason why we talk about cities. Now let's get to the smart bit of it, in a few minutes. What I did was that, look at sort of this Google Ngram. It's a really fun thing to do, whatever topic you're sort of researching. And I don't know if you guys can see this clearly, but what I did was I just decided to throw in a few terms, like each one is like the flavor du jour. Today it's wired city, the cyber city, smart city, intelligent city, etc. Right? And one of the things that you actually see is over like a 200-year period, this is all the literature in English. The corpus is only from English. You see a significant growth in the numbers. Of course, there are ups and downs every now and then. And this largely coincided from the middle of the 19th century, particularly when you had the expansion in telecommunications, right? So that's what that points to. So let's take a look at what some of these terms might actually mean, right? There's nothing hard and fast about these labels or titles. So you can plug in other terms and see what it gives you back. Okay, let's take the term cyber cities. What does it actually mean? Now the term, it goes back to cybernetics. Now the Greek origin, which means to govern, right, and is about systems that embody certain goals, right, and I'll emphasize this particular point. The importance of the governance becomes very, very crucial, and I'll get to it later on, right, about how we should possibly be thinking about it in some of the current debates that we are having. Right? The term cyberspace itself, again, which is something very common in our day-to-day parlance, okay, goes back to the American science fiction author William Gibson, and he himself was borrowing that term from the renowned sort of mathematician and philosopher Norbert Wiener's 1948 book Cybernetics, Control and Communication, right? So that's an absolute classic for those of you who've done electrical engineering, computer science, or even some aspects of philosophy and epistemology, right? Now, from that, right, we have the notion of a cyber city, and I'm here quoting a well-known author, Christine Boyer, and she says the cyber city has been called a huge megalopolis, right, without a center, both a city of sprawl and an urban jungle, an unwieldy mixture of dystopia and cyberspace turns the reality of time and space into an imaginary matrix of computer nets electronically linking together distant places around the globe and communicating multilinearly and non-sequentially with vast assemblages of information stored as electronic nodes. So what we're really looking at here is there is a simultaneous, centripetal and centrifugal force that seems to be working here. On the one hand, we're all sort of we're all becoming more and more urban dwellers. On the other hand, there is this tendency to decentralize, right? So there's this tension that's actually taking place in these sort of debates. Now, let's look at wired cities. What exactly are wired cities, right? Now, references to this goes back to, again, like I said, to the advent of telecommunication, you had the telegraph and so on, which a wonderful book by the former economic editors of The Economist refers to as the Victorian Internet, right? And, then of course you had telephony and now the Internet, etc. Now, an article written in 1981 was rather prescient. It said, cable technology is blossoming, and it won't be long before the TV set in the living room turns into a device for shopping at the best stores, conducting bank transactions, taking college courses, right? Familiar? Scanning library reference sources, reading their morning newspaper, and even guarding the home against burglars, right? Okay. Now, then there was a OECD document from 1978. It says the wired city is usually spoken of at the local level, not national or federal. I think this shows a sound instinct, kind of interaction and communal spirit that a wired city can foster if managed rightly, may very deeply into mass manipulation if the scale is allowed to grow too large. Again, does that sound familiar? Right? So, the thing is, what this particular these definitions on this slide point to is that there is a social dimension that one must tag to the spatial dimension of bringing in technology into the city, right? And we need to sort of explore that, and we have to sort of connect that with the governance issue that we spoke about earlier, that was referred to in the previous slide. Now, this, what I would call, is a somewhat clean, well-defined aesthetic notion of what a wired city is. And why do I say that? Look at this. This is also wired, isn't it? In ways that we do not necessarily anticipate. So one of the things about these is about how technology actually manifests itself, how it gets appropriated, right? How it gets deployed. These are issues that we need to think about. So this also applies to what we call the smart city. So we need to think about what is it that we mean when we think about technology, right? Is it, there's a certain tendency to sanitize it, okay, which may not always be valid. And I just want to sort of bring that to your attention. So then what is a smart city, right? Now this goes back, I take this definition from the World Development Report that's brought out every year, and this report says, you know, a smart city collects a lot of data through instrumentation. We bring these data together through integration and then analyze the integrate data for intelligence to optimize data flows and use predictive analytics for evidence-based decision making, right? Now this particular definition, right, is sort of widely used, okay, and is the emphasis in this definition is clearly, unambiguously on the technology. Collect data, process it, right, and then come out with some results which forms the basis for some kind of decision making or what they call predictive analytics. Now, the question therefore we have to ask is that, is this the only way of thinking about smart cities, right? And if onus of that definition, right, is going to be placed on technology alone, right? In a sense, what a definition like this also raises a lot of questions. It says collect lots of data, right? What is lots of data? What kind of data is it? You know, questions of relevance, right? So how do you know this is, you know, it might be lots. Is it relevant, irrelevant? Those are all questions we need to think through. Bring these together through integration. Now, how do you combine different kinds of data? Okay. Do you want to combine certain kinds of personal information that is collected with certain kinds of data that might be collected from other sources? So, who decides on what kind of integration actually takes place, right? So, this is another question that emerges. To optimize data flows and use predictive analytics, right? You want to optimize data flows, okay? So, in a sense, what this is primarily a transactions-based approach, right? So, you have a set of nodes, you have flows, and then you're trying to optimize those flows. In other words, the city is conceptualized as little more than a set of flows. Okay. Now, the thing is, whether it's right or wrong is a separate question. What we need to understand here is analytically what this definition implies, right? I don't necessarily want to say that this is how you should think. I would want to say this is how I'd like to provoke you and ask and see if you can ask certain kinds of questions about the nature of the debate that we're having. Right? So that's what I see my purpose as, not to give you a right or wrong answer about whether we should be putting more money into smart cities. That's not the point. Okay. Now, in our own country, in about 2014, 2015, when the current government had its first term, the Indian Smart Cities Mission was launched. And the original intent was to promote 100 cities that provide core infrastructure and give a decent quality of life to its citizens, a clean and sustainable environment, and application of smart solutions, right? Now, this again immediately, I hope you can see, or I suppose you can see, raises a number of questions, right? Core infrastructure, what is core, what's not core, these are definitional issues, A decent quality of life. What is decent? To whom? Right? In a sprawling metropolis, take Bangalore for instance, 9 million, 10 million people, right? Whose city are we talking about? Who makes claims to a decent living? Who cannot? So again, it raises a set of issues. And a clean and sustainable environment, that again is up for debate, even as we speak, right? People well above our pay grade are debating these weighty matters in places like Madrid and Brussels. There's a huge international negotiation going on, right, about what it means to be sustainable. So, and that scales across all levels. Okay. But to sort of slightly shift gears, what the Indian Smart City Mission says is that each city, okay, has to formulate its own concept, vision, mission and plan for a smart city appropriate to its local context, resources and levels of ambition. So in a sense, the city has a lot more agency here, right? So even if we don't necessarily are not able to, we are not necessarily able to come down whose city or whom or what, there's at least a little more agency. In that sense, and I sort of juxtapose these two definitions or these approaches, if you might, because one is gives you in one the emphasis is significantly on technology. The other one says, take it, run it, and come back and tell me what you want. Right? Now, what is it that actually makes sense? Right? Does the smart city make any more sense in one of these two approaches? How do we interpret it? Okay. Now, let me add at the very start that interpreting or to sort of pass any judgment on the Indian Smart City Mission is perhaps too early because the projects are still underway. Not too many projects have started. Even fewer have been completed. Right? And there's a lot of uncertainty about what it is going to be. We don't know the time frames and so on. But with what little we have, right, we can try and grab a sort of we can try and sort of give to ourselves an analytical lens to understand what its implications are, given that this is how it's been formulated. All right. Now, the emphasis on technology is global, right? And I want to start off there. It's, that's the whole sort of the rhetoric of smart cities, right? And a lot of that has actually been pushed in part by people who are urban planners, people who are sort of urbanists more broadly, because given the levels of, or given the kinds of challenges cities across the world face, right, not necessarily only in India, right, of a variety of sort of, on a variety of issues, from flooding and the threat of submergence of Venice, to violence in places like Johannesburg, right, to congestion in a variety of cities, traffic congestion and so on. People have, planners have almost sort of lost an institutional focus, and technology seems like the last card in your hand that you're willing to play. Okay? So you say, this is manna from heaven for me. Let me see what it will do for me. And they get egged on, right, by any number of, those peddling boxes, and often snake oil promises, right, mostly vendors, consultants, and so on, saying, you do this, congestion will be history, urban poverty will be history, urban housing will no longer be a problem, right, and so on and so on. So, the betting on smart cities is primarily it's almost a sense of, in some cases, a sense of desperation, right? Our urban challenges are growing. We are unsure how to deal with them. Okay? So can we seek refuge? That's the thing. And possibly one of the most well-known, well-publicized is the one in Masdar in Abu Dhabi. It's about roughly about a decade, and they got the money, the cash to splurge, and they went ahead to build this, right? And it's called, it was I got this quote from somewhere, Masdar's zero carbon green, okay, could also become the world's first green town. Because the set of associated activities that you think about when you consider a city, right, it's not there. Okay. And so while you might put all your money in this infrastructure, the question is, you've created a spatial entity. But what you not yet answer is, what about the social entity that you think about when you talk about a city? See, because the city is a socio-spatial entity, right? And that's the real challenge here. From a sociologist whom I deeply admire, and probably many of you you're also familiar with, Richard Sennett, right? And for those of you who haven't seen his work, I'd highly recommend Sennett. So he says, incorporating every bit of high tech into your design to monitor and regulate a city's functioning leaves little opportunity for an urban experience that is apparently disorderly but experientially rich. Now think about that photograph that I showed. Disorder. Experientially rich. Why experientially rich? In the sense, all your sort of cognitive senses are bombarded. Right? The visual, right? The auditory, the nasal, right? The sights, the sounds, the smells, right? That kind of experience, right, is not what you'll get in a place that is where everything is controlled. Part of this comes from the fact that there is not too much tight control on who behaves how, right? That's part of the argument, right? Now, a comprehensively planned city as a closed system where unforeseen activity is either incorporated into existing rules, that is the algorithms that tell you what to do, how to do, when to do, where to do, of the system, or expelled as irrelevant noise, right? So essentially, activity that is not considered in some way contributing to urban function is seen as noise, right? And for those of you, who are aware of Shannon's theorem, or or electrical engineers by training, you want to minimize the noise to signal ratio, right? And that's the kind of approach you get if you take a very limited definition of what the city is like. Right? The thing is, the city, what Sennett is really trying to tell us is that cities bring together people not only for just economic activity, but historically, if you look at where some of the most interesting ideas have come from, they've all been very urban in nature. Okay? What cities do, or any human encounter, it doesn't necessarily have to be in this artifice called city, because the notion of a city itself is very fuzzy. Come to think about it, right? But nevertheless, what you're essentially trying to argue, what Sennett is arguing here, is that human encounter, or the greater the sort of the chances of human encounter, the combinatorial possibilities of new ideas, right, of you're confronting different forms of living, right, are enhanced substantially, right? And that is what is a problem when you have very tightly designed, closely monitored spaces. You are trying consciously to minimize those combinatorial possibilities. Okay. And I now turn to some of the work of another sociologist whom I happen to admire, and who is coincidentally Richard Sennett's wife, Saskia Sassen, she's Dutch. She's using our ability to centralize information gathering and processing to dictate choices that limit citizens' ability to make sense of the conditions in which they live. See, because one of the things that technology does for you, okay, is that it gives you a certain amount of scale and an ability to centralize. That's the power of technology, right? You can maintain a single database, and you can do all kinds of data integration that you want with that, or data manipulation that you want with that. But the moment you are able to do that, right, you're giving a single point of entry into various sources of information. You're able to centralize that. That ability to for sort of decentralized information, decentralized data, or data to remain decentralized, let me put it that way, and providing or using that as a means to take or make behavioral decisions becomes significantly curtailed. Yeah, you follow what I'm saying? If there's any issues, please ask. Because then you're saying we have a single point, you have potentially a single point of control. You may not necessarily control everything, but then you at least have that point of control. And then Saskia Sassen makes a sort of wonderful, so it's just a play on words, but she makes this lovely distinction because she says a censored city is about installing, experimenting, testing or discovering to generate innovations. As the city becomes a living lab for smart urban technologies that can handle various systems that a city requires. But she warns us, if you push that too hard, that censored city becomes a censored city. The S gets replaced with a C. And the tendency is to make technologies invisible, both physically and metaphorically, may put them in command rather than in dialogue with users. So, I'm sure most of you have gone to shopping malls, and we'll take that as an example of a smart city redux. We'll call that a smart space, right? And many of them love to sort of paint that picture themselves, right? So you all been to, most of you, or at least all of you, anybody here who hasn't been to a shopping mall? Okay, good. It's almost redemptive, isn't it? But the thing is, if you go to most of these shopping malls, they typically will advertise themselves as public spaces. You have a cinema, you have, of course, you have all these stores, then you have a cinema, you typically have a food court, and certain other amenities that you might, want, in a quote unquote public space. Right? But how public do you think it really is? Right? One of the characteristics of that public space is that it's very heavily monitored, right? And there are eyes that pry. And if you happen to go there, and behave in a certain way, or go there dressed in a certain manner that is deemed inappropriate, right? You're almost inevitably, right, going to attract the attention of those who are maintaining the orderliness of that place. So what happens is that the notion of what is sort of public, right, takes a bit of a hit, because it's not the kind of public space you are really talking about. Now, if you go back to that street in Delhi that I pointed out, okay, or if you go to say Avenue Road or Chickpet in Bangalore, where there are a lot of merchants who sell jewelry and silk sarees and things like that. Okay, those streets are not very different from what you saw at Delhi Street. If you go to Avenue Road, Chickpet area, and I'm sure each city has its own equivalent, right? Many of those guys are also wary of customers quietly vanishing from their stores without paying for the product. So of course they'll have cameras, they'll have RFID tags, all those sorts of things that we are familiar with. But the crucial distinction is this. That's in what we call the private realm, right? That's not in the public realm. Right? We don't confuse the urban street or urban open space with the so-called public space in the mall. Right? The distinction between the private and the public becomes very blurred. Right? And although in the other case, in the case of the street in Delhi, or wherever it is that you want to say, the distinction is fairly sharp, and the irony or the interesting fact is that that place on the streets of Delhi or in any other city is just as secure. Right? Because you're part of a community, because there are what Jane Jacobs wonderfully termed eyes on the street. Right? Jane Jacobs was a homemaker in the US in the early 1960s who saw all this redevelopment taking place in New York. Streets being widened, houses being torn apart, right? And said, look, and this, a lot of it was under the guise of sort of security, improving amenities and so on. She said, look, I feel much more insecure here. Why? Because I can't talk to my neighbor or the chap who sells vegetables down the road, right? So what Jane Jacobs was talking about, okay, and something that is of great relevance even to this day. And ironically, even though Jacobs didn't have any formal training in urban planning, I think her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, right, is something which I would recommend you read. Is by far the most widely read book by any urban planning student. Right? So the thing is, it just comes out of observation that what she saw in her neighborhood, and this need for sort of that there are many ways of maintaining security. You don't have to do it through these elaborate measures of collecting data, processing that data, and then coming out with predictive analytics. Not that it is not unimportant, but the question is where and when and how. So this thing is not about is smart city good or bad, right? That's a dumb question to ask, frankly. But the question is, how do you actually think about definitions? How do you think about contextualizing or applicational, where is it that you actually apply some of those things, right? That is the real challenge and the question that we want to pose ourselves. All right. Now, this is of course from the 21st century. What's happening in Abu Dhabi, and there are some earlier examples in South Korea, Songdo, etc., which you can look up. But call it the temptation, or the sort of the attraction of using technology is not something that's new, right? So if you go back to the previous century, I'll show you some examples. What happened was, okay, before I get there, I'll show you this. The notion of what kind of technologies you use, right, is not necessarily limited to physical entities, right? And in response to sort of the conditions, and this is actually a photograph of mid-19th century Manchester, right? The kind that Marx and Engels were writing about, right? Really desperate conditions, industrial workers, this is the first industrial revolution. Manchester was where it all happened, right? Of course, the fact that some of these conditions exist in our cities to this day is another kind of a tragedy, but we won't go there for now. But, so there were all these sort of, ideas of creating what are called garden cities, and sort of you see this diagram. I'm sorry if it's not terribly clear. The city is in the core. The city is in the core, and there's this sort of call to sort of build all these, what came to be known as sort of the town-country interface around these dense, polluted, miserable living conditions of English industrial cities. So the idea of sort of bringing in various kinds of technology, and part of and one of the technologies that they used at that time was to open up the countryside using one of the most prominent technologies of the 19th century, the railways. So you could actually commute from the city center to these what they call town-country interfaces, which you now call suburbs. So there were these sort of efforts to bring together technology with other forms of organization in order to alleviate and overcome some of the so what were perceived to be by reformers at that time the darker sides of industrial progress. Then in the roughly around in the 1920s, right, the extremely well-known French architect Le Corbusier, who in the 1950s also designed Chandigarh, came up with this notion or came up with this sort of a grand concept for a city for 3 million. And this was what he called the city in the park. The whole idea of this sort of the city in the park was that he had a series of these high-rise buildings exploiting a new material that became available to architects in the early 20th century, which was reinforced concrete. And the city itself was structured along these major axes to provide mobility using another early 20th century advance, which is the automobile. Right? So it was the effort to sort of bring these in, right? And to capture what you call like, what in German they call Zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, right? Of a certain kind of modernity, right? Just like information communication technologies seem to represent the zeitgeist of our times, that we are talking about, the kinds of definitions that we had in the very first slide. That was the zeitgeist of the early 20th century, and to create cities around those technologies. All right, so, and these were some of the sketches. But I want to ask you, is there something about these sketches that strikes you as interesting or as idiosyncratic? Precisely. Absolutely right. So in the larger vision, right, so it was all, to Corbusier, the designing of the city was like a piece of sculpture, right, where you had a new material, concrete, you had new technologies that you could deploy, right, and what was even more interesting was that the metaphor that was used, and this is where the zeitgeist comes in, the spirit of the time, was the city is like a machine, right? It's a huge center of production, right? And so Corbusier went down to the level of detailing individual and designing individual apartments and so on with this whole notion of efficiency. Because you also have to remember that it is at about that time, right, that the field of industrial engineering actually emerged, right, looking at questions of time and motion studies, right. So that was actually translated into the realm of the urban, and you had a new kind of a socio-spatial conception that actually emerged. Okay. So this would prove extremely influential, which is why in many parts of the world, cars are very, very dominant. All right. And of course, this is interesting because this is a very smart piece of technology back then. In 1932 in London, Ludgate Circus, the first ever traffic light, right? It's about moderating traffic flows. So you see at different points in time technology gets introduced. So the question is, what are they introducing it for? What is it? Who are the people behind it? These are all important questions that we must be asking to interrogate this concept. Now, our own sort of romance with this, okay, started back in 2010, 2011, when in Gujarat, there was this idea of this setting up a smart city, and so on. So I'll just sort of very quickly run you through. So, they use all these like these terms are very global. These are not limited to India, right? state-of-the-art infrastructure, world-class infrastructure, those kinds of terms, and the financial smart city. That's what it is all supposed to be about. It's called GIFT, right? GIFT city. That is what it is. And here are some images. Do you see the striking resemblance with Corbusier's modernist vision? Ha! The nature lover in you, Bidisha. I'm sorry. I guess you picked it up. Yes. She's all green thumbs. But the thing is this, the lack of any sort of human skill, the lack of any sort of spatial, role for the human being here is striking in the conceptual framing. Right? It's not necessarily that they obviously want people to occupy all the floors and pay them good rent. They want the real estate market to work very well, but it's just that they don't want them visible on their glossy brochures. Right? Okay, here's some on the banks of the Sabarmati, and it will be an exclusive and secure zone. That's what they said, with an ideal work-life balance. Now, the question of ideal work-life balance for whom is again another question. Who can afford to get in there? Whose work-life balance? And frankly, if you didn't have half a dozen people come to take care of your house during the day, you neither have work nor life. Right? So, and those people are going to be far away, probably on the other bank of the Sabarmati. Okay, now, so there was all these debates that were, of course, going on, not surprisingly. Just hang on, I'll come back to you. Okay. So there was all these things that were going on, but these were the early days. To be very fair, these were the early days of the debate in India, and yeah. So these were some of the, the other one was the Dholera project, and the irony of that was what I saw on this bottom. See the third thing. Where is the community? I mean, there are a few trees that Bidisha might love, but other than that, where is that community? Right? The irony of all of this was probably lost in some of these people. There are two parts. Two ways of looking at that. Why don't I just put a dot and say city from infinity? Because I know buildings are going to come, the infrastructure is going to come. What do I have to boast of? And why is it that I'm actually coming to this city? And there's another aspect, if you sort of zero in from that dot, right? What do I know about each of these buildings? Right? You talk about a community life. Am I going to find hospitals there? Am I going to find schools there? Colleges there? What is it that, are you going to give me an opportunity, right, to function as something beyond what economists would call homo economicus? Right? What is the functional distribution? Right? How is it then that you're actually going to bring in people there? Who are the kind of people who are going to be living there? Right? These are questions you might want to know. That's why. Right? Look, at one level, yes, who can argue? Right? Like you're saying, somebody doesn't want to put people on them, and you do see some cases like that. You see many advertisements here, these exclusive Spanish villas in the middle of the tropics, thank you, with all people with blonde hair and blue eyes. You've probably seen that, plenty of it. So, who are we to argue against that, right? Somebody wants to push a particular thing. But the thing is, I think the larger issue here is not just that. You're putting in a lot of public money. Somebody said that. Did you say that? I wanted to come back to you. Because it's not just somebody's private development. That's their lookout. They can push it or peddle it in any way that they want. But if you're going to spend a lot of money acquiring land, displacing people, building the infrastructure, all from the taxpayers' money, then there should hopefully be some accountability. And that is going to be detailed in the granularity of what you offer beyond a glossy brochure. But like I said, you can think of it as the initial phase of India's romance with smart cities. To be very fair, come 2015, actually a lot of that evaporated, in part because the Indian Smart City Mission very quickly realized that the original idea of building 100 greenfield cities was a total pipe dream. I mean, where are you going to get the land for building so many cities, right? It was just not realistic. So what really then happened, okay, were two things. One is a lot of the development under the so-called smart cities program in the country, the smart cities mission, were largely limited to what came to be known as area development plans. You primarily take one locality, one neighborhood from that city, and then you essentially bid for that and say, look, this is how we think certain things are going to, this is how we would like to improve that particular area or neighborhood. So vast majority of the projects have taken that particular form. It's not that. There are two aspects here that I would like to sort of emphasize when we talk about the Indian Smart Cities Mission, and to sort of contrast it with this sort of this more, what shall I say, this global notion of sort of technology alone. Because, okay, I'll come to that. Okay. Oh, this is, I wanted to share with you a couple of photographs, right? So this is Dholera and Gift City in Gujarat, right? This is this place called Manik Chowk in Ahmedabad. How many of you have been to Ahmedabad? To Manik Chowk, yeah? So, which you know is like a very dense, crowded marketplace, right? And what do you get to see there? You see sites like this, right? They're not selling Gucci, under sort of, under the private, under a camera or something like that. This is the kind of thing, and you saw the contrast with what was sort of advertised. So the thing is, if you think of the city as a socio-spatial entity, then you want to ask, whom are you designing these for? Are you designing these for, especially when you're going to put in a lot of public money? It's not a private enclave. Okay. All right. Now, there are two things that I would like to sort of point out here. Actually, what I call the SCM in practice. And this is why the Indian Smart City Mission has thankfully moved away from these greenfield city projects, right? We have now sort of told cities that you can actually come up with your own definition of what you mean by smartness. It's not necessarily going to be something that you have to sort of, that has to be influenced by technology. And and if you actually look at sort of the spending, developmental budget of 12 leading SCM sectors, information technology explicitly has only about 3.7% of the total budget. So it's not necessarily about our mission saying that, this is all about technology. I think there has been a lot of critique of the SCM project, but the whole SCM, the Smart City Mission, but many of these critiques have often been misplaced because they appropriate these sort of global critiques and simply put them here. There are other reasons why we can critically think about them, think about this whole mission. Okay. There are two parts. So first I'll talk about the budget. Okay, and then second I'll talk about, going back to the concept we started off with, cybernetics governance. Right? We'll end with that. If you look at the actual developmental budget, you will see that about 1/4 of it roughly goes to transport. Okay. Then the transport and energy, right? So these are all basically based on what you might call network technologies, right? You want to get roads, you want to get electricity, etc., and you want to optimize those flows. So that's about little more than 40%, right? So in a sense, critiquing this whole thing for an emphasis on technology is probably irrelevant. Now, but if you actually take a look at the breakup of the transport sector itself, what you see is that you see roads gobbling up 22%, parking, right? That's 17. So you have almost 40, and traffic is another 12, 52. Now, if you actually include this multimodal hub and a transport multiple, which means looking at sort of multiple or integrated forms of transport, you have more than 2/3 of it actually going to private transit. So it is not so much that our smart city mission invites criticism or a critique on the basis of its emphasis on technology, but rather saying how is that money actually being spent, what is it being directed towards, right? So you have a significant, and look at the amount, if you look at pedestrian infrastructure, it's 5%, it's laughable. Right, in a country like ours where there's an enormous amount of pedestrian traffic, right? So it is that kind of emphasis that I think is worth asking questions about. Who is it actually benefiting? Rather than saying, okay, are we with, or is it a question of technology or not? So it's largely for motorized transport or transit, and for a section of the, and it's only a small section of the population that actually goes that way. So when you think about, pedestrian traffic, bicycle lanes, and a variety of other options that could potentially open up, right? They're not exactly represented. So that is one critique. The other one is how this whole program is managed. The Indian Smart Cities mission not only requires cities to bid, right? And once you bid, right, and you are awarded a project, that project is actually, it's done through the state. So each municipality or each city corporation routes it through the state. And then once you are given that, the management of the project itself is done through what is called a special purpose vehicle, right, which is established under the Companies Act of 2013. So if you establish that under the Companies Act, it says that, it does two things. One, it expects you to raise some private money, private capital, okay, and the question is how many cities are actually able to do that. The bigger metropolitan areas may be able to do that, smaller towns less ably so, or at least the wealthier cities better place to do that. And it also says that no more than 40% of your board can actually be people who do not belong to the state, right? But what happens in reality is that if you look at the composition of the boards of these SPVs, okay, of the 60%, the vast majority of them, because the money is coming through the state government, is all dominated by state level bureaucrats. And if you look at one of the premise of the whole smart city mission, it is to be inclusive, right? It is to create an inclusive mechanism. It's to make sure that the project is inclusive. It reaches out to different sections of society, right? Now, unfortunately, if your board is going to be dominated by people who are, state level bureaucrats, if you're at the state capital, maybe things work for you. But if you're in a second, like say Hubli in Karnataka, you don't necessarily have access to some of these guys. Your voice doesn't necessarily get heard. And even within the cities, as a result, which cities which benefit from this mission, empirically it is, there are some preliminary results. This is by no means conclusive. So be careful of in citing this, that it's the more affluent parts of these cities that get the benefits, because they're the ones who can get the water. So the thing is, these distinctions that start to appear as a consequence of the smart cities mission, okay, in some ways, is really reproduction of certain existing inequities within our cities. And in fact, you mentioned the BRTS in Hubli. A lot of the projects that are now being taken up, right, are actually used to be part of what was called the Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewal Management Fund, the JNNUR, which got repackaged, really speaking, right? So things that couldn't get funded or didn't meet the bar or whatever reason or couldn't get money got rolled over into this one. So it's sort of a new manifestation of old JNN URM projects. So you have this kind of this, given the way the project is governed, which is very critical here, largely by state level bureaucrats, which bypasses for the most part municipalities and does not necessarily help them build the capabilities that they may need, right? You are left with a situation where people don't have access to some of these resources, have a voice in them, right? And you should therefore not be surprised if you see, more sort of pet projects that favor either motorized transport, or actually if you look at the other thing that I wanted to sort of mention very quickly is if you look at things like housing, right? If you look at the breakup of housing, I didn't give it to you here, a lot of it has to do with real estate development, right? So essentially it is you are seeing certain specific groups within the urban areas that are actually benefiting from these projects, and the creation of many of these urban assets, right, is also leading to or pointing us or taking us back to the older problems of saying, how do you acquire land? How do you have to do slum clearance, quote unquote, right? Is it justified under SCM? Is it what inclusion means, right? So there are many, many questions that arise, right? So what I want to sort of leave you with, and I'll sort of open the floor to questions, is that on one hand, you have this notion of the smart city that is sort of heavily emphasizes technology, right? And you know that that's not going very far, right? But on the other hand, if you also go to you take a very different position like the Indian Smart Cities Mission has. Say, okay, we're not necessarily going to emphasize the technology, but you come and tell us what you want, right? What then happens is that it becomes a reproduction, or at least in our context, of existing social cleavages, if not inequities, right? So those existing social cleavages tend to get reproduced because of people who can sort of scream the loudest, as they say, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. So that's really, in a sense, what is happening, right? So I think I'm done. Okay. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them, or we can just we can have a discussion. You don't necessarily have to be question and answers. So it's 5:05. So for those of you who want to leave, that's fine. I'm sure you had a long day, but for those of you who want to stay back, we can chat, whatever. Okay, thank you.